Hello and welcome to the international webinar series on Gandhi's legacy, reflections and reprisals. We are privileged to have as our speaker for today's session Dr. Venu Govindu of IISC Bengaluru. Uh, Dr. Govindu is a scientist, is a scholar who traverses several disciplines in sciences and social sciences. He works broadly in the field of vision geometry, but he's also the author of a remarkable biography, J.C. Kumarappa, the Gandhian Economist, tit- titled The Web of Freedom. So, without further ado, I request Dr. Govindu to begin with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shashwat. I hope I'm audible. Yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, and thank you all for joining in. So before I begin my presentation, I just want to point out that the Kumarappa biography was co-authored with Deepak Malgan. So it's a joint endeavor. So let me just, me being trained as an engineer, I tend to give talks with slides, and I thought I would do the same here. Maybe it's not usual practice in the humanities to do so. So I'll just going to switch over to my presentation, and then we'll walk through it. Just give me a moment. So can you just please confirm if the slide is clearly visible?
Yes, it is.
Ashwath? Yes, it is. Yeah. Okay. So, so thanks once again for joining in. Today, I'm going to talk about, Gandhi seems to be eternally relevant and revisited and critiqued and criticized in along so many dimensions because the man actually reflected on uh, an enormous range of ideas and issues. So there is scarcely a topic under the sun that has not, that has not had Gandhi reflect on it in some manner or the other. Um, so we are quite familiar with many of those dimensions, and as this series progresses, you must have had different people talk about different aspects of Gandhi's life and legacy and his work in his own lifetime. So for our purposes today, I thought I will speak on something that we generally don't dwell on as much, which is Gandhi's ideas in the economic realm. And just as a quick aside, I mean, this gentleman that you see in the foreground on the left is J.C. Kumarappa, on whom we will have, we'll have occasion to discuss his ideas in this talk as well. Okay, so where do we start? We could as well start with what's going on around us at this point in time. We are in very difficult times as far as the world is concerned. There are rather unprecedented dislocations and enormous hardship that has been inflicted on millions and millions of people. And India, of course, is paying a very heavy price for, owing to the impact of the pandemic that we are still seeing, and it doesn't seem to be taking a turn, a downward turn anytime soon. Okay, so the picture that you see on the top is something that we are all very familiar with. It is in the early days of the national lockdown that was announced, and these are all people who are trying to go back to their villages from some city. I presume it's a picture from Delhi, but it doesn't really matter because this was a universal story. And what it's telling us is that this narrative that we have had for a while, which is that the urban growth model is going to actually is sort of the way to address the problems of the village or the countryside, may have an element of a grain of truth in them, but also have a pretty large uh, problematic underbelly, if you will, right? And so you suddenly realize that the rug is pulled under millions of people's feet who are already working on very low reserves, and so they are unable to even make their keep body and soul together, in a manner of speaking, in the city, and then they were all heading back home for the relative safety of their own natal household. But this picture that you see on the bottom is a newer one, And it says, the caption, as you can see, it says people feel that they are sitting idle in their villages because there's no work available, and then they need to migrate back from, from your state of Odisha, and many of them in this particular instance were returning to the mills in Surat. So you have this sort of scenario where people have security or of livelihood of their well-being neither in the city nor in the village, and that's the lived reality for millions of people in our country. And it's actually a global phenomena. And what you see in the bottom, the caption that you see is which is pointing to a global food crisis that's coming, that's looming in front of us. Actually, we are probably well into it at this point. Is from the New York Times. And so essentially, the impact of the pandemic is showing up the failures of the economic order that we have had across the world for a long time now. The other dimension of that story is the caption at the top that you see, which basically says the nine richest Indians now own wealth equivalent to the bottom 50% of the country. Now, that's really off the charts as far as inequality is concerned. It's actually, I know, in my opinion, it's an obscenity for nine individuals to own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the country, when the bottom 50%, or in fact, probably the bottom 75%, are really struggling in so many different ways. Um, and what is striking about this notion of a food crisis that is looming in front of us in 2020 is actually this quote that you can see, which is about from 100 years ago, that Gandhi said in a famous debate with Tagore, where he said, to a people famishing and idle, the only acceptable form in which God can dare appear is work and the promise of food as wages. And the ironic thing is that Gandhi was saying this in 1921, but it looks like we are faced with a very similar scenario. It is not to say that things have not improved at all in 100 years. There have been enormous gains as far as well-being of individuals is concerned at a global level. But nevertheless, this particular crisis of the ability to work and earn one's living and live a wholesome life, or at least a life with a modicum of dignity, that particular crisis doesn't seem to have disappeared, right? It's still very much there. And we are all very familiar with what Gandhi's views are on rural and agrarian India, and often we tend to also have ideas which are somewhat skewed in our understanding of what is it that he was trying to say. So there are lots of myths surrounding what Gandhi's position was with regard to the village as such in our polity and in our economy. And I thought it's important to remind ourselves as to what he actually said on one occasion, at least in 1927. He said, "The more I penetrate the villages, the greater is the shock delivered as I perceive the blank stare in the eyes of villagers I meet, having nothing else to do but to work as laborers side by side with their bullocks. They have become almost like them. It is a tragedy of the first magnitude that millions have ceased to use their hands as hands." Now, that's a very sharp indictment. I mean, it's actually like probably would be considered politically incorrect today to describe the situation in the village in the terms that Gandhi uses. But that's the lived reality, the stark reality that he was observing as a man who was intimately familiar with the reality of the Indian countryside. And then he goes on to say, and in the last line of this particular paragraph of his article says, "A semi-starved nation can have neither religion nor art nor organization." And so we are essentially, you can see an element of what Gandhi was indicating here. For him, the economic question was not just merely an economic one. It was essentially not divorced from the existential realities in many other aspects of life, right? It was not divorced from politics. In his opinion, it was not divorced from religion, which we will not, of course, discuss today. But in his in his sort of way of looking at the world, there was no real distinction between all of these different aspects of life. Um, so one important way of thinking, and for our purposes, to parse through what Gandhi had to say was this notion of Swaraj. His notion of Swaraj was distinct from the idea of winning political freedom, which is what the Congress was espousing, political freedom from a colonial enterprise. But his Swaraj was actually looking beyond the end of British rule, and it encompassed a variety of other freedoms that are essential for an individual or a community to actually live a wholesome, healthy life. And so, in particular, we will focus on the economic dimension, but I want to point out that Gandhi was very equally concerned with many other aspects of this notion of Swaraj that he had elucidated over a long period of time of engagement in both in South Africa and in India. And in particular, we should make a distinction between the usual notion of freedom that we have in mind versus what in philosophy people call autonomy. Freedom is, well, in one way of thinking about it, is freedom is the usual notion of freedom is a negative freedom, as in uh, it is essentially being free from certain constraints, right? Things that inhibit or constrain you from doing what you wish to do, that constitutes a form of freedom. But autonomy is something different, right? Autonomy is actually operating at a higher plane, if you will. It's a positive freedom where you are endowed with the agency to act out your wishes or your desires in the fullest sense, right? And of course, there are constraints in terms of what how you are acting out would impinge on the well-being of others, but in principle, so think about the fact that if you're politically free, we in India today, everybody is more or less free to vote. So you have a certain nominal, degree of political freedom. But if you do not have money in your pocket, or if you do not have a source of income, you do not have a stable position which gives you work and a livelihood, then you cannot act out on a number of things that are essential for your well-being. So their autonomy becomes very important. And actually, Gandhi was really largely focused on the notion of autonomy, although he doesn't use that term. So you can think of Gandhi Swaraj as a form of autonomy, and in our case, as economic, along the economic dimension. You could ask what were the tools that Gandhi brought to bear on the problems that he looked at. We are all very familiar with Satyagraha as Gandhi's seminal contribution in terms of both political and personal engagement with questions uh, of of justice, if in a broad sense, right? I mean, and Satyagraha was one method where the non-violent aspect of it was foregrounded, and it enabled of various aspects in terms of enabled the notion of a dialogue and so on and so forth. But the other dimension of Gandhi's work, which was essentially what you could say, to use a ill-defined term, non-political aspect of his life, although that's not entirely true, because in a manner of speaking, everything is political. But for our purposes, we'll use that term. Um, is this body of ideas that he called constructive work, where you intervene in different dimensions of life, and we are asking questions about how do you bring about certain kinds of transformations in the social order or in the cultural sphere, or and all of these different aspects are equally important for one's well-being, and not the economic or the political dimension alone. And so Gandhi brought to bear a number of, he built a number of organizations to further these ideas. For example, Khadi, the campaign against untouchability in the 30s in particular, 30s and 40s, so 30s onwards. But then he brought in ideas of a new notion of education, what he called Nai Talim. And all of these different aspects of his interventions in the social order of India can go under the rubric of constructive work. And so, to go back to our economic context, the challenge that Gandhi was faced with was the following. It was a mighty challenge, and by no means did he or succeed in solving it to the fullest measure. But we are very interested. We should be very interested in trying to understand what was his basic impulse and what he tried to set out to do in the economic context. So he was looking at a scenario in India where you had an overwhelming number of people dependent on agriculture for their livelihood. And so it was skewed for various historical reasons, got to do with the way the colonial economy functioned and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, at the time, let's say in the 20s and 30s, Gandhi is looking at large numbers of people, the masses who have no assets, who have very little or no education, and have low skills, right? Low technical skills or any kind of skills which would enable them to command a price in the marketplace for their labors. So, what this is essentially giving you is a scenario where there is an enormous asymmetry of economic power between large numbers of people and a few powerful entities out there who hold either, let's say, the capital or the levers of political power or social power, like the upper castes in villages or in urban India. And so you have this scenario where there's an enormous asymmetry of economic power and other forms of power. And of course, coupled with that is this growing urban rural divide that Gandhi was able to perceive. Of course, that divide is much more starker in our lifetime than in his, but the beginnings were very much there at that point in time. And so, given this challenge, what was Gandhi's answer? His answer was to focus on the village, as we all know, and at least one dimension of it was to focus on khadi and later on village industries, and we'll have occasion to look at it later in this talk. But you might want to ask, why the village? And there are again a number of ideas and myths and contentious debates about Gandhi's position on the role of the village. Gandhi, of course, foregrounded the village and the rural order of living in the economic sense and the political sense in his arguments. But one primary impulse was, it was not an impulse to go back to some golden utopian age of the past, right? That's often one of the common misunderstandings that we have as to what, with regard to what Gandhi was trying to do here. His focus on the village was primarily because the vast, overwhelming majority of Indians at that time lived in the villages, right? And in fact, as the exodus of people from urban India to rural India in recent times, the first picture that we saw today, as that picture shows us, I mean, they still are very much connected to their rural homeland, right? And so it was essentially just a simple question of addressing the challenges where they needed to be addressed. And the question there of why did Gandhi choose khadi, which seemed like a primitive idea of trying to work with your hands and so on and so forth, as opposed to bringing in advanced technologies, let's say, is and that's a question that was posed to Gandhi during his lifetime. He was critiqued a lot in his lifetime, and has that debate has not died out, right? I mean, that's ever since that whole question has resonated in our discourse. So the picture that you see in this slide is, many of you would be familiar with this. It's a rather famous one. It's from September 1931 in London, where Gandhi was present for the second roundtable conference. And the man sitting beside him is the famous actor Charlie Chaplin. Now, Chaplin came from a very poor background, and he was very curious to meet Gandhi and understand his economic ideas, because and they had a long, lengthy engagement. And the sort of summary, if you will, which is provided by Pyare Lal, Gandhi's secretary, in his words, was that Gandhi made a distinction in answer to a question about his position on the role of machines. Gandhi's distinction was between mass production and production by the masses. So when we talk about industrialization, the modern industrial economy, we are talking about mass production. And what Gandhi was doing was really inverting the order of significance, and he was essentially saying that he would prefer that the production be done by the masses, that is, a large number of people have a role in economic activity, right? I mean, that's the basic idea. And fundamentally, and we will develop on this idea in a moment, but fundamentally, the answer that Gandhi was seeking in the economic order that he was proposing was to address the needs for equity, justice, and dignity. Now, these are all very loaded terms, and it's a tall order. And suffice to say that no ism. Of course, Gandhi was not interested in creating an ism of his own, but to cut a long story short, no particular ism has been really able to address these questions to the fullest extent. Um, but Gandhi's ideas, he was no economist, um, and this has been one of the standard critiques of Gandhi's thinking, that it is not systematic and so on and so forth. Well, he was approaching questions in an elemental sense. That is, he would approach questions and look at them with regard to the fundamental assumptions, the axiomatics, if you will, and then work his way up in terms of making inferences. And Gandhi is one man who was radical in the sense that he never shied away from making the inferences that he saw as being correct, and then deriving them and moving forward to their fullest extent. So many of us hold back when we see that there is a big challenge to the established way of thinking. Then we sort of tend to hold back. But Gandhi, in that sense, was no hold barred, right? And so there is a modest body of work on what may be called Gandhian economics. I don't particularly like the term, but it will do for the moment for our purposes. And so the man who did much to develop these ideas in a fuller sense is J.C. Kumarappa, who worked very closely with Gandhi in the 30s and 40s. And so Kumarappa, in his essay in the Gandhian Economy in 1949, says if there's anything that characterizes Gandhiji's life, it is his devotion to truth and nonviolence. Any economy that is associated with his name should therefore answer to these fundamental principles. Now, how do you translate these abstract ethical or moral notions of truth and nonviolence to economic questions or principles or policies is a complicated endeavor, and it has lots of issues that arise in that process. So we will not enter into too many of those questions, but let's remember, this is just a reminder that if one were to associate anything with Gandhi's name, then they have to address these particular prerequisites of being axiomatically consistent with truth and nonviolence. There is another interesting quote that I have put on this particular slide that you see here, is by this economist Anjaria, who was quite well known in his time. So in 1941, he makes an important point that we should keep in mind as we parse through what Gandhi said or did or didn't do. And basically, Anjaria points out that the Gandhian system of economic thought cannot be adequately appraised merely in terms of current economic theory, which rests on certain limited assumptions. It is a challenge to those assumptions themselves, right? So that's the basic point that one has to keep in mind, that Gandhi's questions are a challenge to what you might call, modern economic theory in many ways. Now, this is something that has been recognized implicitly in many different ways, and people have addressed this, in their own work. But so even in Gandhi's own lifetime, this understanding was quite clear. Okay, so I'll move now to. I'm not going to spend any time on looking at Gandhi's work on Khadi and all that, although that's rather important to understand how he approached questions from a very practical viewpoint, because Gandhi was no ivory tower or academic theorist, right? He was very rooted in the lived realities of one's life. And but the man who actually spent a lifetime developing Gandhi's economic ideas and fleshing them out in their fullest sense is J.C. Kumarappa, who lived between 1892 to 1960. And I'm going to just very rapidly compress a very interesting life of this man into one slide. And basically, he is an economic philosopher of the first rate, and he was also a keen constructive worker, primarily in the economic sense. So Kumarappa was well known in his lifetime and since as a critic of large-scale industrialization, and he spent a lifetime championing the cause of the agrarian economy, and along with it, the use of village industries for providing employment, but also village industries as a significant part of the economic order. But enfolded in Kumarappa's economic understanding is his environmental thinking. So he is one of the earliest individuals, certainly in India, but I would say even in global terms, to understand very clearly the relationship between what economic order that you build and the environmental consequences thereof. And so Kumarappa, you have to understand that today the environmental question is looming in front of our eyes, and no thinking individual can shy away from it. And there is a clear understanding of the relationship between the environmental question and rather the economic order that we have and the environmental question that it engenders. But in the 30s, if you think about Kumarappa's time when he was proposing these or thinking through these questions very clearly, in the 30s, the environmental question had not become so serious, right? India was not yet so as industrialized as it is today, and also not as polluted, or our natural resources were not as degraded as they are today. But so we'll have, time permitting, towards the end of this talk, I will talk a little bit about Kumarappa's environmental ideas. And just for your reference, these are his two well-known tracts, if you will, Why the Village Movement, that he wrote in 1936, and a more well-known volume called Economy of Permanence, which was published in 1945. He wrote it in prison during Quit India. So before I move to what Kumarappa has to say in particular, I just want to set the context within which his ideas were being developed. So uh, I've sort of given you a sort of a caricature, if you will, of the economic debates in modern Indian history, let's say the first half of the 20th century. So there was a clear awareness of the colonial extraction of resources from India, and the corollary version of that is the control of our markets, right? So you had a double whammy in India, which is led to a severe economic problem in all aspects of Indian life. And so the nationalist movement in India, in particular, even in the pre Gandhian era, was very strongly marked by an economic critique of colonialism, right? So if you think about the late 19th century, India was rather special because you had people like Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt and others provide a very strong and very clear critique of the economic impact of the colonization of India, right? So, and this idea was very clearly established by the time Gandhi came into the public limelight in India in the 20s, let's say early 20s, although he came back in 1915 from South Africa. Um, and this is an idea that was well established. But actually, one of the uh, other dimensions of the thinking that Indian nationalists had at that point, Gandhi is an exception to this, but by and large, pretty much everyone else who mattered embraced what I call the logic of industrialization. Right? So they wanted to get rid of colonialism, they wanted to get rid of the British, but the question of how do we go forward was really, it was a given that India had to rapidly industrialize in the manner of the West, right? And that was a logic that was accepted by Nehru. It was accepted by many other individuals across the political spectrum. There may be shades of difference in nuance between them, but primarily this was the understanding. And in the 20s and 30s, the debate really, especially in the 30s, the debate really was of whether India needed to, what you may call, today we may frame it as a capitalism versus socialism debate. But capitalism was sort of had the negative mark of being brought, essentially associated with empire at a global level. And for a lot of people, a lot of stalwarts of India's freedom movement and outside the Congress, let's say, many people accepted this idea of socialism as, or a socialist economy as the way to move forward. Now, what happened with that post independence is a different story. We will not enter into that particular discussion, although it's rather important. But roughly speaking, the debate was essentially between market and state, and then India effectively embraced the notion of state-driven, a dirigist economy in the 50s, and then in the 90s we sort of moved back towards a more market-oriented economy. But and this is the broader sort of the thrust of history, if you will, within which the economic question was being shaped, or the economic choices were being shaped. And in particular, the context of 1930s in which Kumarappa was working was got to do with it was right after the collapse of civil disobedience, and this is the context which we generally tend not to think about too much, was that India was greatly impacted by the Great Depression and the concomitant agrarian crisis that affected the world, but also India was very much, by 31, it was very deeply into this, into the impacts of Great Depression, and the countryside was in serious trouble. And this is the time when Gandhi decided to retire from the Congress, because he felt that the needs of village India could not wait. India was going to be free at one point or the other, but Gandhi felt that he had to address himself to the challenges of the needs of village India. And primarily he was also posing questions about what the future economic order or the political order of India was going to look like once we were free. And so this is the context in which Kumarappa develops his own understanding, and he brings forth his own contributions um, to the economic question. Now, Kumarappa clearly recognized that the colonial economic history, at least the lesson, let me rephrase it. The lesson that Kumarappa learned from the colonial economic history that he was familiar with was different from that of other nationalists in the Indian freedom struggle. So he recognized that essentially large scale industrialization, whether it is driven by the colonial order or by industrialists in a free India, would have similar consequences for the vast majority of people. And he was also a critic of, he brought in a trenchant critique of uh, standard economic theory, if you will, right, microeconomic ideas and so on and so forth, which had taken hold fairly strongly in at least among the educated classes at that time. And to cut a long story short, essentially what Kumarappa was arguing for was local production for local consumption. And you would notice I've italicized for because that's very important. I mean, the fundamental argument that Gandhi and Kumarappa were making is that the only way we can get large numbers of people to participate in the economic order is by making them economic actors, where by allowing them to produce, to participate in economic production, right? And now if they were to produce it for the city, as is the case today and was the case in their lifetime as well, but certainly as is the case today, um, then you have a problem, right? Because you don't have consumption happening at a local level, and they were trying to essentially ask, how do we bootstrap and build a decentralized economic order, because the resources available for people and the technological tools that they can afford were limited in terms of the cost factor and the sophistication of uh, economic activity and so on and so forth, right? And so what they were very keen on was to actually develop a theory of economic decentralization which foregrounded the role of the individual in a decentralized economy as opposed to a centralized one that we are all participants in today. And along with it, Kumarappa, as I pointed out, had a very keen understanding on the ecological dimension that went along with economic activity. Um, so, in particular, his critique of large scale industrialization, he has over a long period of time developed a particular critique of that, but I'll just sort of summarize it somewhat here. And he essentially says, so the primary argument really had been, and this is not Kumarappa alone, a large number of people have made this argument, that in the modern economic order, production is delinked from consumption, right? A few people consume, and then all economic activity are largely skewed towards meeting the requirements of those who have the purchasing power and have the ability to consume in a particular fashion. So now, beyond your immediate material needs of food, clothing, housing, or whatever you might think of as elementary needs of a human being, then your consumption is essentially going to be one which is driven by other kinds of notions of status and power and so on and so forth. And that really brings in, well, that essentially ends up concentrating economic power because, the whole production activity is skewed in a particular direction. And in particular, when you have large scale industrialization, one of the tendencies is been and continues to be one of reducing the prices of commodities. And by and large, if your imperative is to keep consumer prices low, then effectively one easy way or relatively easy way for an industrialist to achieve that is to reduce wages, right? And that's something that we are seeing play out in so many ways in terms of the depressed wages that individuals can command in the urban marketplace. But also, if you think about the current debate about minimum support price and all the associated questions that arise with agriculture and their ability, farmers' ability to support themselves on the price that their agrarian commodities can command in the marketplace, it is a form of depressed wages, right? Because essentially what we are doing, broadly speaking, in India is we are paying them a low amount of wages for their work. And the vast majority of consumers who are not embedded in the agrarian economy benefit a lot from the fact that food prices are rather low in India, right? On a comparative scale. But the other consequence of the economic order, that where large scale industry and capital controls production is a form what is well known as wage slavery, right? And this is something that is, an understanding that arose in the debates around industrialization in Europe for a really long time, for at least 200 years. And essentially, the basic point is that work is controlled um, by a few people, because if you have a factory kind of context, only a certain number of individuals can afford to put in the capital to set up a large factory, and then it is they who control the nature of wages, or the kind of jobs that are available, what salaries are going to be made available, and so on and so forth. And you see a new form of that in the so-called service economy that is grown a lot in urban India today, with delivery services, with taxi services, with food delivery services, and so on and so forth. And it has created what is known as precarious work, right? Because it's work where people are worked a lot for low wages, but also do not have the security of a stable job, and essentially are effectively, let's put it bluntly, are like slaves of a certain kind, right? And the other aspect that Kumarappa was very keen on critiquing was this notion of efficiency of large scale industries, right? So, one of the points that is made is this whole business of economies of scale. And it is certainly true that, when you have large scale production with high end technology, then you do achieve certain economies of scale. But there are two other consequences two other aspects to it, which we need to pay attention to. The first one is that much of this efficiency of the economic order is also achieved by state intervention. There are lots of state policies which are skewed towards favoring large scale enterprises. And we've been quite familiar in India for the last 30 years or so, where states have to compete with each other to get, to be seen by their voters as bringing in jobs, primarily in the middle class or the upper class economy, bringing in software jobs, or bringing in, setting up a factory, or wooing multinational investment, right? I mean, corporate investment in India. And so without those kinds of subsidies, which are really available to the capitalist, the efficiency of large scale industries would look very different. And the other point that Kumarappa was essentially making here is got to do with, well, firstly, is got to do with this notion of efficiency, where state policy plays a very big role in defining the let's say the net balance of economic activity, what the balance sheet would look like. But he also was keen on pointing out that while these large scale industries may be efficient in a particular sense, they're also environmentally very profligate, right? So, for example, one of the biggest consequences of rapid growth, let's say in India and definitely also in China, has been that much of the effluents of economic of say factory production are simply dumped into the ecosystem, right? And nobody and the owners of those enterprises simply don't bother to treat those effluents and pollutants in any manner whatsoever, which causes enormous damage to the environment, and also consequences for people who live in that particular context, and they have to suffer through this. Now, this is a story that's writ large across the ecological landscape of India, and I would think of China as well. And so, this is the point, that one of the strong critiques that Kumarappa was making in terms of the consequences of large scale industrialization. And essentially, his argument was that centralization is a form of violence. It's not a form of physical violence as we may think of the term, but really, when you have a scenario where a few people control the economic destiny of large numbers of people and can get away with impunity as far as their not being accountable in any manner to both to the state or to society at large, then that's a form of violence that they're inflicting on the rest of us. And so this actually reminds me of what Gandhi said way back almost 95 years ago, where he said, "What is industrialism but the control of the majority by a small minority?" Now that may seem like a bit of an extreme version of the argument, but there you have it, right? I mean, that's basically making a very important point, that we cannot delink the benefits of large scale industrialization from both the social, human, and ecological consequences. So to conclude this particular segment of the discussion, the fundamental conclusion that Kumarappa reached was that centralization of industries is inimical to the development of democracy in politics. Now, let's take a minute to sort of parse through what this might mean. So, what Kumarappa is essentially saying is that, this is, I'm paraphrasing it in my own vocabulary here. What he was essentially saying is that, if you think about our political system, we are called one man or one woman, one vote. Everybody is supposed to have an equal say, at least notionally, right, in the democratic process, at least in elections, let's say. But when it comes to the economic question, when you have a scenario where it is one rupee, one vote, then you have enormous consequences, right? So apart from all the impacts of large-scale industrialization that I talked about, it is patently clear to all of us that a handful of capitalists are able to influence policy in their favor, right? Which is why you have this enormous, this monster statistic that I showed you at the beginning of this talk, which says that nine wealthiest people in India own more wealth than the bottom 50%. Now, it simply cannot be that that's the case, that it is actually earned in an honest fashion, so to speak, right? It cannot be that those individuals are that much more productive than everyone else. It has got to do with the manner in which they are able to control the political order of the day. And so essentially, so you have all of these consequences, and this is the critique that actually underpins the economic activity that they were proposing, right? So it is, so Kumarappa and Gandhi were positing a way of doing economic activity within limited resources in their time, in their lifetime. We may modify or amend that to our needs today, but the fundamental critique that they were bringing to bear as of the economic order that was being proposed then, which is to build large-scale industrialization, that question does not go away. And by the way, although I have not dwelt on it much because we are not really looking at a socialist order today, Kumarap also spent a lot of time debating with other individuals who were important in that period. For example, Jayaprakash Narayan. Kumarappa spent a lot of time debate and developing an argument that this problem of centralization of economic activity in industrial production, the problems that are concomitant with it are not specific to the capitalist order alone. He was essentially saying it's independent of whether you have a socialist economy or a capitalist one. And in many ways, he was proven to be correct, right? I mean, if you really think about the fact that um, many of the environmental consequences that happened in the erstwhile Soviet Union happened under a so-called socialist or a communist order, and but nevertheless those issues had not gone away because they are intrinsic to the mode of economic production, which is basically high input and high volumes of output, roughly speaking, right? Okay, so I'll take a few more minutes to wrap up because I think it's important to also bring in Kumarappa's environmental understanding, and this sort of helps us round out much of what we have talked about. We have spent a fair bit of time looking at the consequences of industrialization, and in a more sort of philosophical sense, or in economic, in sense of economic theory, one of the arguments that Kumarappa makes is that endless growth, which is essentially what is a one big driver, an implicit, unstated driver for the modern economic engine. Endless growth is based on a false scale of values, and it's essentially, we know that it is materially not possible to keep growing endlessly, but endless growth is also, there's a philosophical argument that you can make that it is driven by a false notion of what your values ought to be. And primarily, Kumarappa makes a strong argument that material, the relationship of material wealth and human, welfare. Now, it's nobody's case, certainly not, and I hear this phrase being used a lot, that Gandhi advocated poverty, which is, pardon me for saying it, is rather a ridiculous idea. Nobody interested in the welfare of human beings would advocate poverty. What Gandhi and Kumarappa were really positing was very simple and straightforward, and this goes back to the argument that I made, that Gandhi was not willing, was willing to go forward and work out the consequences of his basic understanding. And the basic idea is very simple, that if we were to believe in a democratic order, not merely in the political sense, but if everybody has at least an equitable share in economic production and the rewards of economic activity, then in a decentralized economy that they were proposing, the rewards are going to be moderate. Not everybody could be fabulously wealthy like one of these, big entities that we have today, right? So if everybody has to have a fair share in the economic order, then what you will end up with is a notion of simplicity, perhaps, right? Because your economic, your spending capacity cannot be as high, you cannot as some people have today, and so you end up with a scenario where you would have an enormous transformation of the nature of the landscape of our economic system today, right? But if you truly are interested in addressing equity and justice in the economic sense, then you have to accept the fact that the rewards are also going to be moderate, because they have, the rewards have to be shared across across the entire population in a reasonable fashion, and it cannot just be that 9 people hold 50% of the wealth, more than 50% of the wealth of the bottom, of the country, right? And the other point that ties in with this is that if you bring in an ecological argument or if you bring in an ecological understanding for material growth, then you have to really distinguish between stock and flow, right? Stock is, roughly speaking, your reserves. For example, your mineral resources are your stock because they are finite in size, and your ability to use them would, you would end up exhausting mineral resources if you profligate with it, which is really what we are doing today. And in fact, Kumarappa was positing this way of looking at the economic system, which was based on flows. So flows has got to do with circulation of energy. So, for example, regeneration, so growing of crops, you can grow another harvest for the next season, and so on and so forth. The natural cycle of water, our monsoon-driven cycle, is also a flow in the ecosystem. And primarily, they were positing a way of building an economy which is largely centered on flows. It is not to say that you don't use stock at all, but it's largely focused on using flows, because that is really what you might use in today's vocabulary, the term sustainable, right? But of course, we have a strange scenario today where even the stock of water, if you will, groundwater, largely is a stock, right? And its replenishment rate is rather slow, but we are, in most places in this country, we are tapping into it and using it in a very profligate manner. And I'll just wind up by just pointing out to this quote that Kumarappa writes in a particular article in 1947. Remember, this is the time when the debates on the future of the economic order in independent India were at the fore. And he says, he's asking the question, what is progress? And he says, progress signifies both the search after knowledge and truth as found in nature, and its application to satisfy human needs. So remember that these are not people who are advocating this false notion of poverty, right? They are saying we want to satisfy human needs, but we have to do it by accepting the constraints that nature imposes on us, right? In the measure in which we are able to pull alongside nature's dictates, we shall be progressing in the right direction. So the basic yardstick or rule of thumb that is giving us is to say that if you were to ask, is this consistent with the natural order in the ecosystem that we see around us, of our understanding of the ecosystem or the constraints that it imposes on us? If we understand it, and then if we ask the question, in what manner, in what sense is our economic activity consistent or congruent with it, then we are progressing in the right direction. And so anyway, so I've already pointed out that he was a significant thinker, so I won't spend any more time in the dwelling on it, in the interest of ending my talk. So the basic question that it leaves us is a question of, is the perennial problem, right? What is the sort of economy that we want? And especially in today's economy, where mass production is the norm, and you have all kinds of new transformations with information technologies and so on and so forth, and automation and all the other consequences that are attendant to it, we have to ask questions about where is the notion of human dignity and creative freedom available for individuals, right? So this becomes very, very important in our current scenario. And of course, there is the whole environmental crisis that's coupled with this, and there's no getting away from it. And primarily, a lot of this is driven by the concentration of economic and therefore political power in a few hands. And certainly, the role of the state becomes an important question. And so, these are the questions that Gandhi and Kumarappa grappled with in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And it looks like those questions have not gone away. So it is worth looking at the kind of questions and the answers that they were providing in their own lifetime, and asking to what extent or in what sense do they make sense or are relevant for our purposes today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Govindu, for what was an extremely engaging lecture. Uh, One of the things that we often face while thinking of Gandhi, while speaking on Gandhi, and this is one of the challenges that people often tend to think of Gandhi as some figure who's located outside history, outside some immediate context, which is why the be it views on villages, the views on economy, and a few other issues. It's almost people look at him in a mythical lens, and which is why we fail to understand the comprehensive nature of his thinking, or even his ability to uh, change his views to revise his. So your lecture, I think, takes in perspective and helps us understand Gandhi and Gandhian legacy to Madhav as they were thinking and writing in certain historical contexts. So thank you so much for showing new light on such topics. We have a few questions. Um, So the first question is, what are your thoughts on the appropriation of Gandhian economic thoughts in current times? Are there real similarities or is it just a second peak?
I suppose you're alluding to the claims for on of Swadeshi, for example, of the RSS and at least some elements in the current political dispensation. If that's really what you're talking about, I think it's an important question to address, because I think I would say the blame also lies with the rest of the people who may be opposed to the political and the social and cultural project that is underway in the country. But well, firstly, because we have largely failed to own and understand Gandhi's ideas on in these terms, and we have effectively disowned parts of this part of his legacy. So it is there in terms of, it's available for people to use and abuse it. Certainly abuse, because Gandhi's ideas on economic thinking there may be similarities or some kind of sort of congruences, but but you have to understand that Gandhi was a comprehensive thinker, and you cannot divorce, although for our purposes we only looked at the economic question, you simply cannot divorce it from the notion of what kind of political order that you want to have, right? What kind of social order that you want to have. And if you want to talk about Gandhi's understanding of the political order or the social order, then as I said, that he is very much interested in the autonomy of the individual, and that individual can be of any caste, any religion, any gender, any region, or any other form of diversity that one can think of, right? And if you were to ask the question that is the underlying premise that is driving a particular economic argument today consistent with this sort of more comprehensive understanding of Gandhi, then I think you will have your answer as to whether it is just a genuine one or driven by other political compulsions.
Thank you. Could you very quickly reiterate Gandhi's opposition to industrialization as one of
Shashwat, I'm
the
having trouble following you because I think there is some distortion of your voice. Could you repeat that?
yes, there seems to be some there seems to be a lot of echo. I understand.
Right.
But putting a question mentioned by one of our viewers, to very quickly reiterate the grounds on which
I'm
Gandhi
sorry.
opposed.
I'm sorry. I have to interrupt you. Do you mind? Maybe is it possible for you to just type it out? Because I hope I'm clear. My audio is clear, right?
Yes, yes.
Because I'm having trouble. You're following what you're saying because it seems to get muffled and distorted for various reasons. So just maybe slow down and just state briefly what the question is. So okay, so Gandhi's opposition to industrialization is really got to do with the question. So he's asking. Here is the question that Gandhi is asking, right? He's not opposed to industrialization per se. He's opposed to a particular form of industrialization that we commonly attribute to be the only form of industrialization, right? And essentially, so for example, there's a famous story of him saying that, that he's not opposed to all forms of machine, is a sewing machine, not one. But we'll leave that aside. So primarily, Gandhi and Kumarappa were essentially saying that fine, we can have economic production, you can have industrialization, but what is the role that individuals will have in that economic production? So if you have a very sophisticated uh, factory producing textiles, that's going to employ a few people on wages that are going to be determined by that particular owner of that entity. And so, what is going to be the consequence of that, right? So, firstly, when production is cornered by a few people, then you have this problem of the economic freedom or autonomy of individuals being stripped away, right? So and this has been seen throughout since in Gandhi's time and ever since, right? Every time you have a new type of technology. I mean, I am an engineer. I work in computer vision, which is amongst mm, contemporary, what you might call the higher end of technology, right? But you have to be extremely mindful of the consequences that you engender in society when you build an industrial order and not ask questions about what are the consequences of doing that, right? So certainly it deprives people of the ability to define their own livelihood, right? Or to control their own livelihood. If you are only dependent on the wages that are offered by a few individuals, then you are not really free. And this is not true just of people who are wage workers, but I would say, for example, people in the software sector in my city here, Bengaluru, right? I mean, they are not truly free. Obviously, they're earning a significantly higher amount of money than, let's say, a wage laborer does. They have a pretty good lively income, but they're not truly free because of various consequences that arise of the way the economy is structured. The other critique that both Gandhi and Kumarappa bring forth is also very important, is that large scale production cannot be divorced from the human consequences, right, and the social impact that it has on the well-being of large numbers of people. But you can't divorce it from the environmental consequences either. One cannot think of such large scale production and the scales of consumption that we have in India and definitely in the Western world today without being cognizant of the fact that it is all driven by essentially cannibalizing our natural resources, right? So you're doing it, you're paying, future generations, we are already paying a big price, right? Suddenly now you'll see people talking about smog and pollution in Delhi and why farmers in Punjab are responsible for stubble burning and the usual nonsense of news reports on an annual basis. That cycle is back, we are entering that cycle again. But fundamentally, you cannot get away from that question of what is the environmental consequence. All of us are paying the price for that, whether you are benefiting from that economic order or not. And you can imagine what is the future that is going to be available for future generations in a scenario where impact of, for example, climate change and so on and so forth are very much clear. And the impact of climate change, for example, cannot be divorced from that of industrialization. Now, this may not be an argument, climate change may not be an argument that Gandhi made, but if you really look closely, starting from his tract, his polemic in Swaraj, this line of argument is very clear in both Gandhi and Kumarappa and many others. That's a very interesting and important question. I didn't have time to think about it. Now, Gandhi's own position on the Varna order, on the caste question, is a complicated one, and is also very deeply contested. Right? I mean, in today's India, and for the longest time, it has been contested. It has also been critiqued, and rightly so. So Gandhi's ideas on caste had evolved, and one of the conundra that he had, he didn't, he didn't really fully flesh out the the connection between caste and the economic order that you have, right? But what you are seeing today, for example, one of the arguments that you see in terms of looking to urban India as the answer to the evils of the caste system in the countryside is something that Gandhi was very clear that was the wrong solution for a real problem, because essentially you're not going to be able to address the consequence, the issues of autonomy of the individual. Now, this is not something that he explicitly linked and stated, but clearly, much of the economic activity was an indirect attack on the caste order. And I will not dwell too much on it. I'm happy to take this offline because it needs nuance, because it's, in these questions, Gandhi tends to be more misunderstood than understood. But I'll just point out one important missing link in this story is, in you should remember that Gandhi was not talking about agriculture in his lifetime. He was talking about, an agrarian economy. And the reason is twofold. One is he clearly recognized that agriculture couldn't sustain all, everybody in the rural areas, and you needed to sort of bootstrap a new agrarian economy. But also there was a clear understanding that the land question, which was and continues to be a very important question in terms of social justice in the countryside, the land question was really outside their purview in a colonial economic order. Now, what happened with land reforms later is a completely different story. We failed in a very serious manner to affect land reforms. But I think Gandhi never really, as far as I understand it, never really explicitly spelled out these connections. And I think that's an important question to ask and address. One of the biggest problems or limitations of the time that they had was really the land question that they didn't quite develop, or they couldn't develop. And without really addressing the land question, it's going to be very hard to address the caste question too, right? But what they were saying was that it was not independent of how you want to address the social dimensions of the caste question. Moving people into an urban context as faceless mass labor is not going to be an answer. Okay, so I'll stop at that, and then maybe we can take on other questions, but I'm happy to discuss this offline. Yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, certainly we have a big problem. We have both, we've sort of failed to do both, right? We've failed to provide a healthy economy in our rural areas, um, and we are unable to, provide a good solution in the urban areas too. So where does Kumarappa stand? I really don't know. I mean, I think, where does anybody stand in this economic scenario of the world today, especially, in this particular year? I mean, I think we are staring at a very, very serious, fundamental existential question for the system, for where things are. And honestly, I don't think most of us are facing up to the realities that we have around. So I don't think, well, Kumarappa is relevant. So it is up to us, those who think he's relevant, to think about it and press for some of the arguments. Just in case you're interested, I wrote a piece in Wire a few months ago. You can just Google for it, where I argued for the need for reinvestment in rural areas, because that was the time when people had moved back to their villages. And if you think about it, I mean, it's very simple. If you are going to provide some kind of a dignified way of making a living in the village, there's no reason for most people to move to the city and suffer through the ignominy of having to live in a slum with no resources, and so on and so forth, right? And so the fundamental argument I think all of us should be pushing for, whether independent of whether we believe or agree with Gandhi or Kumarappa or anyone else, is that it's high time that we actually start investing resources into the rural economy. Now, how to do it is a complicated story, and there are many people who are much more well versed than I am to give you answers as to what should happen in this particular context in, let's say, in 2020. But the fundamental question is very simple. If we are to be a healthy democracy, then we have to, and there, Shashwat has flashed that particular link. So, but, to come back to my point, if we believe that we are a democracy, or we ought to be one, then there is no question, that there is grave injustice has been done to the rural areas, has continued to be done in so many ways, right? And so let us put, we should demand that our government should put money where it belongs. It belongs in investments in so many different areas which are lacking in the rural areas. For example, in health, in education, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And we can argue about what is the appropriate forms of technology and what kinds of interventions we need and so on and so forth. And let me also just end this particular answer by saying that we shouldn't make a fetish of Gandhi and Kumarappa, right? They were immensely creative individuals in their own lifetime. They were willing to think through things from first principles, and we shouldn't just make them into a meaningless mantra, if you will, right? We should take the essence of what arguments they're making, test it against our own understanding and reason, and then ask how does it work today. So you cannot simply translate or simply transplant their ideas from 20s and 30s and 40s into the India of today. You have to work on it.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Govindu. Really sorry for the
Thanks.
audio issues at my end,
No worries, Shashwat. Yeah, no worries. Thanks.
but I think you've summed up what perhaps I would have wanted to say at the end, uh, that we need to move beyond this fetishization of these individuals who spent years, perhaps decades, in developing their ideas and thoughts. Uh, I thank you once again, sincerely, for patiently answering the question and for your insightful talk. Thank
Thanks
our
for having
viewers.
me. Yeah.
Please do join us on the 16th of October for the next talk, which will be delivered by Dr. Nishikant Polge of CSBS Delhi.
Thank
He'll
you.
be speaking
Thanks.
of Gandhi and us. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for your time. And it was a pleasure.